My name is Lauren. I'm 37, and I'm married to James, a dedicated 40-year-old driver. Our marriage is peaceful, with no big fights or outbursts, but his routine and absences have created an emptiness that only grows. I love the man I chose, but I can't deny that something in me cries out for more. A spark, a new meaning, anything to make me feel alive again. I look around my house, silent and always the same, and wonder, can life be more than this? I look at my house and once again, it seems too big for me. That's when my sister called, almost bluntly, asking for help. She needed me to house Ryan, her 23-year-old son, for a month while he prepared for a military competition. I didn't think twice after all. We're a close-knit family. He arrived on a quiet afternoon, carrying a suitcase and an easy smile. Tall, with a confident yet respectful posture, Ryan seemed such a different man from the boy I remembered. Within minutes, his presence began to change the air in the house. The silence that had previously accompanied me almost like an old friend now seemed broken by a vibrant energy.
Click like now and subscribe to the channel to see more stories like this.
His every movement was natural, but charged with something I couldn't describe. As I helped him organize his things, I realized that, without even trying, Ryan was challenging the monotony that I had already accepted as part of me. Helping him organize his things was just the beginning. As soon as Ryan settled in, I realized that the house no longer looked the same. It wasn't just the new energy he brought, but the way he occupied the spaces, as if he was in the right place, with a naturalness I hadn't expected. In the living room, as he talked about the competition and his plans, something in me began to change. His firm gestures, mature posture, and confident gaze disconcerted me. I tried to see the boy he was, but the man in front of me erased any trace of childhood that remained in my memory. He crossed the room confidently, oblivious to the impact he was making. His well-defined features, the serene tone of his voice, and his striking presence brought a sensation I couldn't quite put my finger on. For a moment, I thought it was loneliness speaking louder, but there was something bigger. He was Ryan, of course, but not the Ryan I knew. He was someone new, unexpected, and somehow impossible to ignore. The days passed quickly, and James soon left for another of his long journeys. I hugged him at the door as usual, wishing him a safe journey, but this time something inside me felt different. When he left, the familiar silence that filled the house didn't return as usual. Ryan's presence gave the room a new rhythm, as if every corner had come alive. In the kitchen, he helped me with small details, chatting about recipes or asking about the family. On the sofa in the living room, our conversations flowed lightly, but with pauses that, although short, carried a subtle tension. The garden, once a place where I reflected alone, now became a stage for exchanging stories about dreams and plans. Ryan had an almost magnetic way of listening, as if my every word mattered. Although everything seemed natural, there was something implicit in every look or gesture, something that neither of us mentioned. The silence between us wasn't empty, but full of possibilities. That morning, the sun was streaming in through the kitchen window, illuminating the room in a welcoming way. It was an ordinary day, but something in me wanted to break the monotony. I chose a light silk sweater, something I rarely wore, but which seemed right for the quiet atmosphere in the house. As I prepared the coffee, I felt Ryan's eyes following me, albeit discreetly. He was sitting at the table, and his normally confident gestures seemed hesitant. I noticed that his cheeks were slightly flushed when our gazes briefly met. There was something about the simplicity of that morning that made everything more charged. The sound of the coffee being poured into the cups, the aroma of the bread on the table, and Ryan's small movements, such as adjusting his spoon or looking away, created an almost intimate atmosphere. I pretended not to notice, but I was aware of every detail. At that moment, the kitchen was no longer just a routine place. It became a space where the unspoken filled the air, dense and inescapable. After breakfast, while I was organizing the mess, I called Ryan over to help me wash the dishes. He approached with the same calm disposition as always, but there was something different in the air. We worked in silence, dividing the tasks almost synchronously. When I held out a plate for him to rinse, our fingers touched briefly, but enough for me to feel my heart racing. He stopped for a second, as if the touch had hit him too, but then continued, trying to disguise it. The sound of water in the sink and small movements filled the space, but the silence between us seemed to speak volumes. The kitchen, so large and airy, suddenly seemed smaller, almost suffocating. The warmth of proximity made every gesture more meaningful. I glanced at him, seeing the subtle tension in his eyes. I realized that neither of us wanted to acknowledge what was happening, but in that instant, it became clear that a limit had been tested. Towards the end of the afternoon, the sun was beginning to peek through the trees, tinting the sky orange. I proposed a walk in the garden, an attempt to relieve the tension that seemed to be growing inside the house. Ryan readily agreed, and we set off together, accompanied by the distant sound of birds. The gentle breeze swayed the leaves, creating a calm scene, but inside me there was a whirlwind. We talked about his competition, his plans and dreams. I listened attentively, but with every pause, our gazes met in a way that seemed to last longer than it should have. There was a weight to each exchange of glances, a feeling that much more was being said in the silence between the words. He smiled lightly, but there was something in his eyes, as if he was trying to decipher my thoughts. The garden, so peaceful and surrounded by life, was just the backdrop. The real storm was there, invisible to anyone, but intense enough to be felt by both of us. That evening, I sat down on the sofa to call James. The conversation was the same as always. He told me about the road, the weather, and asked about things at home. My voice sounded calm, but inside there was something I couldn't control. As I was talking, Ryan came into the room. He was shirtless, wearing only sweatpants, and looked as if he had just stepped out of the shower, his hair still damp. He stopped when he saw me on the phone and leaned against the door, watching. Our eyes met, and my heart leapt. I tried to concentrate on James, who was asking me about the day, but the weight of that gaze made me lose the thread of the conversation. Ryan didn't say anything. He just stood there, unmoving, but his presence was so intense that it seemed to fill the whole room. The room, which had always been so ordinary, now seemed too small for the three of us, even though James was miles away. The silence between Ryan and me screamed something that none of us had the courage to say. After hanging up the phone, I went to my room, trying to find the peace that had seemed to elude me for days. I lay down, but sleep wouldn't come. The image of Ryan standing in the living room, with that look that said so much without uttering a word, wouldn't leave my mind. I rolled over in bed, trying to push the thoughts away, but they came back with even more force. His presence was in every corner of my mind, in every detail. I remembered the quick touch in the kitchen, the weight of our gazes in the garden, and the way the silence between us carried meanings we didn't dare verbalize. The line between right and wrong was becoming increasingly blurred, as if what had once been so clear had now dissolved into doubt. The room was dark, but the tension I felt seemed to illuminate every thought with intensity. It was as if I was torn between the woman I had always been and something new, something that was emerging in an intense way that was impossible to ignore. The next day, as we prepared lunch together, the atmosphere in the kitchen was different. Every move seemed calculated, as if we were both afraid of breaking the fragile balance that hung between us. When we sat down at the table, I tried to keep the conversation light, asking about my studies for the competition, but Ryan diverted the focus, returning questions about my life, my hobbies, my dreams. His words seemed ordinary, but the way he said them carried something extra. With every answer I gave, he smiled in an almost complicit way, as if he knew there was something behind what I was saying. When I praised his discipline and determination, he looked straight at me, with an intensity that almost made me look away. "You're amazing too, Aunt Lauren. More than you know," he said in a low but firm voice. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable, but full of subtext. The table, once a neutral space, now seemed too small for what we weren't saying. After dinner, the air inside the house seemed too thick. I suggested a walk in the garden, trying to dissipate the tension that seemed to grow with each passing moment. Ryan accepted with a calm smile, and we walked out into the soft starlight. The night wind carried the scent of the flowers, but I could hardly pay attention to my surroundings. He started talking about his dreams and his plans for the future, but his voice, firm and serene, had a strange effect on me. Every word seemed to pull me closer. We walked side by side, and the distance between us seemed to diminish with each step, even without any explicit movement. At one point, he stopped and turned to me. Without saying anything, He took my hand. It was a simple gesture, but so full of meaning that my heart raced. His fingers were warm, firm, and the touch felt like a silent invitation, a question that needed no words. I stood there, motionless, realizing that that instant marked something that perhaps couldn't be undone. After the walk, I went back inside with my mind boiling, but the feeling of confinement in the house led me to the veranda.
Click like now and subscribe to the channel to see more stories like this.
I sat on one of the wooden chairs, watching the trees in the distance as the cool night wind touched my face. The darkness was punctuated by the sounds of crickets and moving leaves, but to me, everything seemed amplified. Every corner of the house that had once been familiar now carried a different weight. The kitchen, where the knocks began. The living room, where crossed eyes told silent stories. The garden, where Ryan held my hand and disarmed any barrier I was still trying to maintain. My heart beat fast, torn between two worlds. James, with his constancy, the security of a life built up over the years, and Ryan, the novelty that made me see colors where before there were only shades of gray. There, on that balcony, I realized that it wasn't just about desire. It was about the kind of life I wanted to have, and the kind of woman I was. Knowing that James would be back soon, I decided to prepare a special dinner, perhaps as a way of saying goodbye to whatever was happening between me and Ryan. I chose the best ingredients, carefully set the table, and beckoned him to sit down. He arrived silently, but with that look in his eye that always seemed to say more than his words. We ate in an almost suffocating calm. The sound of the cutlery against the plates was the only thing that broke the silence between us. I could see in his eyes that he wanted to say something, but couldn't find the courage. He looked away at times, fiddling absent-mindedly with his napkin, as if caught between two opposing impulses. His every move struck me differently. I wanted to say something too, but the invisible line between us seemed both tenuous and insurmountable. When our eyes met for the longest time, I realized that the moment was decisive. Something had to be done, or it would be too late. James left early, as usual, with his suitcase on his shoulder and a quick hug goodbye. I watched him walk out of the door, the sound of the truck's engine diminishing until it disappeared completely. I went back inside, but the house seemed bigger than before, almost empty, even though I wasn't really alone. In the kitchen, Ryan was washing the breakfast dishes, his sleeves rolled up as the water ran down the dishes. The repetitive sound of the tap and the dishes being placed in the drainer was the only noise in the room. I sat at the table and watched him in silence, feeling a knot in my stomach that I couldn't ignore. It was as if his every gesture carried an unspoken promise. We didn't exchange many words, but the looks in our eyes said more than any conversation could express. The house, once so full of routine, now seemed to pulsate with something new, something neither of us had the courage to name. Everything seemed suspended, as if we were waiting for something inevitable to finally happen. After dinner, we went into the living room, where the silence continued to hang over us like a palpable presence. I sat down on the sofa, and Ryan followed soon after, occupying the space next to me. Our legs were so close that they were almost touching, but neither of us moved. The television was on, but the sound seemed distant, muffled by the tension that was growing by the second. I could feel his breathing calm down, but when his eyes turned to me, they carried an intensity that made me forget everything around me. We stayed like that, just looking at each other, as if we were each waiting for the other to take the next step. He leaned in slightly, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. My heart beat fast, while my mind was torn between desire and reason. The room, which had once been a haven of calm, now seemed like the epicenter of something I didn't know how to control. When he stepped back without saying a word, I realized that the boundary remained intact, but was on the verge of being breached. The morning of Ryan's departure came too quickly. I helped him pack his things, trying to ignore the tightness that was growing in my chest. The house seemed quieter as he checked the last details. When everything was ready, we walked together to the gate. The sky was clear, but there was a heaviness in the air that neither of us could dispel. He turned to me with a shy smile, but his eyes carried something that words couldn't explain. When he hugged me, I felt the strength in his arms, as if he wanted the moment to last longer than it was allowed to. My heart seemed to beat louder than the sounds around us. "Thank you for everything, Aunt Lauren," he said, his voice low and full of meaning. I replied with a smile, but my throat was too tight for any words. When he finally got into his car and drove away, I stood there at the gate, feeling that something had changed forever. The gate, now empty, seemed to hold the echoes of what was never said. After Ryan left, silence once again dominated the house, but in a different way. It was no longer the silence I knew, the one that kept me company while James was on the road. This one was heavy, filled with recent memories that seemed to echo in every corner. The kitchen brought back the brief touches on the sink and the long looks during coffee. The sofa in the living room, where almost everything happened, seemed to hold a secret that only I knew. On the balcony, the wind seemed to whisper the reflections of that night when I allowed myself to think about the impossible. Every space we shared now bore invisible marks, memories of moments that, although they hadn't crossed the line, left a sense of loss. It wasn't just Ryan who had gone. His absence also took away something that rekindled an intensity in me that I didn't even know still existed. With him gone, I realized that nothing would ever be the same again, and that haunted me more than any silence. James returned a few days later, bringing with him the familiar rhythm that should have comforted me, but which now seemed strange. The routine reestablished itself as usual, with the sounds of the truck's engine, the conversations about the road, and the predictable nights that once filled my life. I tried hard to focus on what mattered, on the man I chose to share my life with. But behind every smile and everyday gesture, Ryan's memory remained vivid. It was a silent presence, hidden between the lines of my daily life, in the moments when I allowed myself to stop and think. What did it mean? Was it just an oversight? A distraction that time would erase? Or something deeper, that revealed a part of me that had never been explored? As I set the dinner table and watched James tell his stories, I can't help but wonder, what if it were different? What would you do if you were me? Share it with me. After all, we all have our own dilemmas of the heart.
This story doesn't end here. Listen to it all by clicking on the exclusive playlist on the right, or click on the video on the left and listen to the best story on the channel.